At 22, I had recently graduated from college, and like a lot of young people, I not only felt invincible and immortal, but there was a sense of the future being limitless with possibility. I had no idea really what I wanted to do, but I was excited to take my time figuring that out. And so I ended up moving to Paris, where I worked as a paralegal, though I had these dreams of maybe somehow, someday becoming a writer. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. But before any of that uh, happened, my life was interrupted. Um, I received a diagnosis of acute myeloid leukemia shortly before my 23rd birthday. And it was one of those moments where you feel a kind of bifurcation, a terrible kind of sundering that happens where there's your life before and everything that comes after.
It did go from taking a beautiful picture of our daughter taking off for Paris with her new red suitcase. I still remember that picture and her smile and the feeling that everything was going, open to her. And then when she came back and not looking so good, and then it took a little while until we got the diagnosis, but the slow realization that this going back home was going to last a little longer. First, for me, it was a huge relief to know that she would be able to come back home and that I would be able to take care of her, because I think it's a mother's first instinct to just want to be there for whatever needs that your children have. So that was first a huge relief. And then there was no question for me that I would put everything aside so that I could be there for you, for Suleika. But of course, there was the fine rope to the fine line to walk between being there for my daughter and not being there too much. She was a young adult; she was not supposed to be here, and I could totally understand that from her point of view. And for mine, I just needed to be there and take care of her.
I've always prided myself on being fiercely independent, on having tough skin. Tough skin is one of those things that we're told we need to cultivate. But my diagnosis really stripped away any semblance of armor that I had. And pretty much right from that first month of beginning treatment, I found myself as dependent on my family and caregivers as I'd been since infancy. And at first, it felt horrifying. It was frustrating. It was humbling in the most brutal sense, to go, from having worked very hard to become an independent adult to suddenly needing help with everything from getting out of bed to fixing myself a sandwich or even walking around, was a kind of terrible reminder of our fragility, of how everything can change, as the author Joan Didion said, in a single ordinary instant. But ultimately, as the months passed, I came to feel a deep sense of appreciation for the fact that I could be dependent, that I had family and friends around me that I could lean on, who could take care of me. For anyone who spent any amount of time in a hospital, you very quickly learn that not everyone has the privilege of having a caregiver. And it's no exaggeration to say that I wouldn't be alive, I think, if it weren't for my family, for the fact that my mom, for example, got to really, focus all of her energies and her time on taking care of me in those early months and years of treatment. But I imagine for you as a caregiver, there's this sense of powerlessness when you get a diagnosis. You have to cede so much control to, the disease that's ravaging the body, to the medical teams, to all the unknowns. And at least for me, it was really hard to know how to swim in that ocean of just uncertainty. And at the time, I was 22, so I didn't necessarily want to have to move back into my childhood bedroom, to have to be so dependent on my parents after working so hard to be my own kind of self-sustaining semi-adult. But it makes sense to me that when you were in action mode and you were taking care of me, that gave you a kind of focusing goal. But one of the early things that we did was a 100-day project that first summer in the hospital. And the concept was really simple. We were each going to do one creative act a day, every day for 100 days. And my dad wrote 101 childhood memories that he compiled into a little booklet and later gave to me. And I'll let my mom talk about her project that she did. But my project was journaling, and it was, felt something that was doable. I wasn't writing for anyone other than myself. It didn't matter how good it was. Didn't matter if it was just a sentence or just a word, but to have something to do other than just being sick was really important. And to be doing that with my family, with my friends, I think really gave us something to talk about other than my diagnosis. And it was this kind of way of staying grounded and inspired and accountable. But Mom, I'd love for you to share what you did for your 100-day project.
Right. So my 100-day project was creating an armor, a shield for Suleika by making a small little ceramic piece that was about this big. I should have one here to show you. And on each ceramic piece, I would sometimes write something, sometimes just put a color or paint a little picture. And they all had holes on the corner, and eventually assemble all these pieces into a shield that looked more like a kimono. And that's hanging on Suleika's childhood bedroom as we speak. And it took actually more than 100 days eventually, because there's a lot of pieces, and she ended up being sick longer than 100 days, but that's what my project was. And I was able to look at it later on. Once all the pieces were done, I reassembled them, and I was able to notice how certain periods had certain colors. There's a point where there are birds appearing, then the birds started to scare me, because I don't know, they looked like they were flying off or something. Then I moved on to something else. So it was her protective piece. At some point, Suleika, after her transplants, kept getting sick again and having to be hospitalized, and she called me to come and stay with her because she needed more care in New York. So I remember that I had not finished assembling this shield, this magic shield that I called, and it still was in like big pieces. And I said, oh my God, I have to finish this protective shield. So I put everything in a little suitcase, and I went to stay with Suleika, and I finished, tying all these little pieces together. And then actually, you never went back to the hospital ever since then. Did you know that?
I didn't know that. I know my friends and family would have, been very sad to hear me express probably just how guilty I felt. But I think it's impossible not to feel like a burden when something is happening in your body that is having this enormous ripple effect that hasn't just upended, your own life, but the lives of everyone you care most and love most in the world. And so I felt guilty about how much time and care I required. I felt guilty about inevitably the time and care that took away from my brother. I felt guilty about the financial strain that it placed on my family, about the fact that my mom had turned away from her work and was spending most of her time that first year focused on my needs. I felt guilty every time my dad would come back from one of his daily walks in the woods and his eyes would look bloodshot. I felt guilty all the time. And, I think part of it was that I wish so badly, of course, that this hadn't happened to me, but that I could somehow spare them of worry. And of course, that wasn't possible. And I knew that then. Um, but it was this sort of constant companion. And the only thing that seemed to sort of alleviate it a little bit was later when I had the opportunity to meet fellow patients who became my friends. When I got the chance to speak to people who had lived what I had lived and to talk about things like guilt and to understand that that sentiment was a shared one. And that in a way it was normal. It didn't make it any less real. But at the very least, I knew I wasn't alone in that feeling of guilt.
I was struck when I read the book. I still found out about quite a few things when I read In Between Two Kingdoms about the fact that Suleika felt guilty about it, and made me very sad. And but I totally understand it. And I think there's not much to do except for realizing that it is normal. And a lot of other issues I struggled with were also lightened a little bit when I found out it was not my own issue, but it was something that had to do with the illness, with the whole situation. There are times when you just don't know how to take care of yourself because it's too much. And one of these times or periods was when Suleika was hospitalized. My husband was back home teaching, and we were staying with friends nearby, but the friends were away. And I would walk back from the hospital each night, walking down Madison Avenue and thinking I was totally drained, exhausted because I wasn't sleeping enough, totally worried. And I was thinking, what can I do to feel better? So I would go in my head through what do I just needed. It's almost like you're just a little bit underneath water. What do you do to just breathe a little bit? So I was thinking about, do I call friends? That's too exhausting. So I would go to the movies. No, that's too overwhelming. And nothing seemed to be desirable in a way. So I kept going but I noticed day after day that at some point during that walk back to our friend's apartment, I would have this feeling of breathing a little better, of relative lightness. And it was always at the same point in my walk back. And then I just noticed I was passing by a window to a gallery that was selling antiques, and they had a beautiful Buddhas that were really like masterpieces that were sitting in that window, and that the kind of peacefulness or the harmonious curves, or who knows, maybe something else, was kind of catching me, maybe like caressing me a little bit and passing, and was making me feel better. And I said, oh my goodness, that's art. So I started going to the Met because it was nearby, and I would go and look at one painting at a time because that's all I could do. So my surprise was that art, I knew that creating art, being creative, was helpful, like we talked about with the 100-day project or being in my studio. But I didn't think that consuming art from the other side would also have this effect. And I'm an artist, I should believe in art. But somehow I thought art, when there are emergencies, when things are too much, that's something art is something for when you have time for art. But it turned out it was not the case. And that was the one thing that made me feel better. I would go and look at the girl with the pearl earring by Vermeer, because it reminded me of Suleika, and then all the relationship between light and dark that he works on. So what I want to talk about is that what I want to say is that sometimes we don't even know what is going to make us feel better, but we have to be maybe observant of these tiny little things that happen and then cultivate them. So that was one.
Mom, I just want to add, I remember one moment early on after my diagnosis, we went to the hospital for a doctor's appointment. My oncologist, the wonderful, brilliant late Dr. Holland, looked at you and noticed you had lost weight. And I remember him very sternly saying to you, you have to take care of yourself so that you can be strong for your daughter. And it's not open to negotiation. You have to prioritize your health. And I was struck by that. And I wonder how it struck you when he said that.
Yeah, what he added is that he said your daughter is going to need you in the long run. And I think as a caretaker, when we have, when we have the announcement of a grave illness, you get into this fight and flight response, and you are the alert all the time, and you don't realize how long it might be. And it was, so that's what struck me about what he said. I knew I had to take care of me, but I thought I could let it go for a little while because I needed so much to do my best. So it is an important thing to know that you don't need to be on the alert all the time, and you can allow some normal life in between, which I didn't know. I thought when someone has cancer, that's it. All they have is cancer. No, that's not true. There are lots of times in between difficult moments or events in the illness when you can not go back to normal, but you can allow yourself to and I would not allow myself. Even my friends I was staying with were insisting once I say, oh, we have a friend we want you to meet. Take the day off and go and meet her in Brooklyn. And I couldn't do that. I thought I had to be there for Suleika every day. So that's something I will have to remember. I could share it for people who are having to face this, is that remember that, yeah, it might be in the long run. And, these times of response in between, of breath in between are so important, and eating.
I think one of the most surprising aspects of the cancer experience was what happened after it was gone. I had this expectation that I would feel excited and that I would somehow eagerly and organically fold back into the rhythms of living, that I would, migrate from the kingdom of the sick and return to the kingdom of the well. And that didn't happen. After, almost 4 years of being sick, I was no longer a cancer patient. But outside of that identity, I really had no idea who I was. And I was really wrestling with the imprints of that experience on my body, on my mind, on my sense of identity and self. And I spent this really difficult passage in the months after I was done with cancer, where I really didn't know how to move forward with my life. And so ultimately, I ended up deciding to go on a road trip because the thing I kind of intuitively knew that I needed most was to learn to navigate the world alone, without a caregiver, without anyone, and to really carve out the space and time I needed to feel safe in my body, to get to know the new person I was becoming, and to make space for all of that. And so I set out on a 15,000-mile road trip.
And Suleika took off on the trip. And actually, of course, I was nervous, especially about her idea of camping. So that was one stick point for me. But luckily, it turned out you got scared the first time, and then you spend a little more time in motels than in camping. So I was secretly happy about that. But otherwise, the principle of traveling like this for me was wonderful, because it meant that things were normal again. That's what a young adult should do. They should scare the parents a little bit with big plans, big projects, things that are going to open their world, a sense of adventure. We don't quite know. They don't know yet, but it's really a beautiful thing to do. And I think that's how I took it mostly, but I was so happy.
But there were so many unexpected moments of grace and mercy, so many unexpected lessons that even in the moment I understood were ones that I wanted to carry forth with me if I did survive. And one of those, and maybe it's an obvious one, was how important it was to have loved ones. It's such a, simple thing that I think a lot of us take for granted until we're in a position where we really need care, where we need an entire village in order to make it through a difficult passage. And so I think as a family, we've grown a lot closer as a result of that experience. I talk to my mom and dad almost every day. This week was an exception because I had a busy week and I didn't call them for an entire week, which, felt like a real novelty and a real transgression. But I don't know that we had that kind of closeness, that kind of relationship. I certainly don't think that as a 22-year-old, I had an appreciation for the countless sacrifices that my parents have made for me. I think, like a lot of young people who are lucky to have loving, caring parents, you take that for granted. So that has been a big thing that I've held on to. The other thing that I've been thinking a lot about in this last year during the pandemic is the importance of community and how we conceive of community. The friends who I expected to be there for me after my diagnosis weren't always the ones who showed up. But the flip side of that was that I met so many people I would never have met if it weren't for my illness. The fellow cancer patients I befriended during those years in treatment, the strangers, and long forgotten childhood friends, the neighbors who showed up, and observing their acts of generosity, I think for me has raised the bar of what it means to be a friend, what it means to have community. It's made me want to be more thoughtful, to be more generous, to be more compassionate. And it's changed the way I approach all of my relationships.
But the concept of moments of grace during Suleika's illness, they were not moments of grace. They were almost like dust, the golden dust that was everywhere. But we learned to notice that were almost like moments of appreciation every time. I don't know if it's the equivalent of a silver lining, but it was not a willful decision to let's look at the bright side of things, but there were bright sides to almost everything, almost every moment. The fact that we were together indeed. I remember Suleika saying, "Oh, now when at the beginning when your boyfriend came back home, and then you said, oh, I'm just missing," and she was back home, and you said, "I just missing Adam," and then everything, my brother and everything will be fine. So that was the most important, having people around, so the sense of community, whether it's family or friends. Or even when we were driving down the highway at 3 a.m. going back to the emergency in New York, 3 hours away, I was incredibly appreciative of the fact that we had a highway to drive on. And that's how I would really look at everything. And maybe that's what helps us, withstand the difficulties of things. But that's how I lived the feeling of grace all throughout, because we were waiting in the waiting room and thinking, oh, looking at someone by themselves and thinking, oh my goodness, I should go and sit next to this person. It's so hard to be by yourself. How lucky we are that we are there as a family. But another big one for me after reading Suleika's book is realizing that I had not faced a lot of fear that I was feeling through her illness. And I put everything aside and I blocked it all. And having reading the book made me face, the reality of what it was. And so that's my moment of grace now. I'm older and I'm determined to be adventurous, as Suleika was, taking the risk and dealing with the concept of fear at my advanced age, right? and then taking this as a lesson that whatever we fear the most, you can hide from it, but it won't help you. And it's if you can, it's much better, and it will get you to maybe an easier feeling of grace if you can face it and tackle with it and live with it and journey with it.
For me, the process of writing is one of excavating the truth beneath the truth beneath the truth. So it's always a transformative experience, whether the subject is my own life or someone else's. And so in writing about my own illness, I really pushed myself not just to kind of widen the aperture of how I understood what had happened to me, but to consider how it had impacted everyone in my radius. My mom very generously gave me her journals from that time so that I could understand her perspective. And that was, profoundly humbling to really get to read in her own words what this experience had meant for her. The process of, going through my medical records, which I had never done, was its own kind of sort of bewildering realization of just how much my body had been through. And it gave me a deeper understanding of why, I still carry some of that wreckage in my body, and more than that, an appreciation for how hard my body had fought and what it had endured. So I think the process of self-examination, of interrogating those pivotal moments in our lives, whether you do it in the context of a book or privately in the confines of a journal, for me has always been an essential process of understanding the world better and understanding myself and my place in the world a little better.